Now, let me see if I can share the screen. And I don't know that I'm going to be able to, oh, I can see you this time. When I gave this morning, all the participants just disappeared completely, so I couldn't see anybody. But if you have a comment or question, please chime in anytime, and I'm going to ask some questions here in just a minute. We're going to hear some commentary by my good friend and colleague, Gordon McCoskey. Again, this is a course where we're learning about the big phenomenon of slavery through the very particular context of Lawrenceville, New Jersey. And today we're going to focus on Liberia. But I want to begin this week where we sort of ended up, and the video that I'm going to show you of this conversation I had with Gordon is a bit of a review from last week. So if somehow you didn't make it or didn't see the recording, that'll be something of a review of what we learned, or you'll learn what we learned last week in brief. But these were some of the questions that we sort of danced around in this first session. First of all, we looked at people in the 19th century dealing with the great issue of the day, namely slavery, and they made some moral decisions about that. We had William Lloyd Garrison, who was abolitionist, very radical for his time. We got to just free all the slaves and help them integrate into society, whatever it costs us to do that. Whatever the costs are of that strategy. Isaac Van Arsdale Brown was very opposed to slavery, but he thought, no, it's too radical for us to set all the slaves free, and they'll never integrate into white society. So the solution, the most moral thing to do, is send them back to Africa, hence the American Colonization Society and the effort to create a colony in Africa, which we'll talk about today. So as we look back on that, how do we view those actions in light of our current moral lens? We might think of ourselves as the smartest and most enlightened generation that's ever inhabited the face of the earth. And we use this lens to look at the decisions of those in the past. This would lead us to conversations about monuments and whether they should be taken down when we learn about the actions of those people we are honoring, maybe not fitting the moral sensibilities of our current age. Today in the discussion, we call that presentism. Somebody brought that term out, which I thought was very interesting. And the other thing is, does this reflection on history, which I find to be really quite fascinating, does it help us as we think about our own moral decision making around the great issues of our day? And finally, maybe most importantly for me as a Christian preacher and teacher, are there some theological doctrines or scriptures or resources, religious resources that might help us in thinking about all this? So keep these questions in the back of your mind as we hear this next segment from Gordon. He's going to speak to some degree on some of these questions, but if there's going to be a little chance after this video for anybody to weigh in on any of these questions, or maybe what your reflections from the last week's course. So without further ado, let's hear from Gordon McCoskey, a few minutes of video from an interview that I did with him last week. So welcome. I'm here with the Reverend Doc. Can you all hear okay? You know what? I think I didn't. I need to share screen again. No, I did. Sorry. Just give a shout out if somehow you can't hear well. Dr. Gordon McCoskey, who is a good friend and colleague of mine, and I appreciate so much you're willing to talk with me and with this class about the afterlives of slavery and this particular context. And today I wanted to focus more on the particular context that is Liberia. And I guess I want to start out with a question, Dr. McCoskey, about why do you think Presbyterians were so much a part of the ACS movement and that particular solution, in quotes, to the problem of slavery in this country?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Of course, Presbyterians were not the only ones who had thought about colonization in West Africa, sending freed slaves and eventually all freed slaves back to Africa. Nor were they the first ones chronologically to think about it. Colonization schemes had been thought about since the Revolutionary period, by Episcopalians and Baptists and other Methodists probably. I'm not sure exactly why the Presbyterians played such a role, except that we're good at organizing things. And you know, Princeton and Lawrenceville Presbyterians had an outsized role to play in the architecture of the United States, through the influence of John Witherspoon on Madison and others whose political theory shaped the country. And a lot of our system of government kind of reflects Calvinist assumptions philosophically. So I think it's a combination of the ethos and also that Presbyterians are very good at getting things done.
Yeah, well, I mean, following on the whole notion of our Calvinist way of seeing things, one of the questions that this class is struggling with in the first session, or one of the questions has to do with, you know, Isaac Van Arsdale Brown believed passionately in this as a solution. From the point of view of now, among certainly the two of us and others, we see that as a terribly racist solution, because it couldn't imagine Black and white people living together. And so I wonder if you could weigh in on this challenge of believing so passionately in this solution. Now we see it as wrong. How might that inform our own thinking about the moral decisions and moral stances that we need to take today? And then after that, I want to move to the context of Liberia, but can you respond to that?
Well, it's very tempting to just judge the past on our own standards, on the values and ideals of our time. The more challenging task is to try to understand people in their own context. And in their own context, as far as I'm able to understand it, the Presbyterians around here thought they were doing something very constructive. They didn't like slavery. They thought it was a moral evil, but they wouldn't condemn it outrightly because letters attributed to Paul, you know, make reference to slavery and assume the existence of the institution. They were afraid of Black uprisings, especially after the Haitian Revolution. They also were opposed vehemently to the abolitionists. They saw those voices as divisive in the church and in the country, and they feared tearing the church apart and the country apart. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So that the fears around here about the abolitionists were realized in a very apocalyptic way decades afterwards. So they thought they were taking a middle way. They thought that the way to deal with race and slavery in America would be to raise money to send freed slaves to Africa, and the freed slaves would be Christian, so they would then spread the gospel in Africa. And they also had the mistaken notion that African Americans had built-in immunities to tropical diseases, whereas white missionaries die like crazy from malaria and all kinds of other diseases. Turns out that the Black people had the same problems with malaria and so on that the white people did. But they also thought that the freed slaves would send a vision of democracy to all of Africa. So this was ticking a number of boxes, morally good boxes. Of course, I just said,
stability, right? Yeah.
What?
Including peace and stability, or the
Yes. Well, that's the other thing. Presbyterians around here in central New Jersey had played an outsized role in establishing and stabilizing the whole country, and so that kind of thing appealed to them. They didn't like the abolitionists for destabilizing things, but at the same time they recognized slavery as an evil. So this was their middle way, kind of Aristotelian middle way strategy, which, as you point out, which the critique goes back to William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote a book exposing the American Colonization Society for being thoroughly racist, which it was. But it was kind of a velvet glove racism, I guess, or something. So if we understand, that doesn't mean we agree with them if we can understand our predecessors in their context. But we do have to give them their due and see if we were in their times, what would we think? It does also raise a question about us. We live in the midst of a world filled with gun violence, economic disparity, fossil fuel dependency, a lot of ambiguous moral situations. And we tend to shy away from radical solutions, and we want more of a gradualist, move toward something. That's not different from their thinking.
Yeah, so interesting. And, letter from a Birmingham jail. So welcome. All right, we're going to stop there, but I want to pause and ask if any of you have comments or reflections based on, what Gordon said, based on those questions, or your reflection from the material so far. Yeah, letter from a Birmingham jail sort of is an important maybe companion to read for us in the position that many of us play in this society at this time. In terms of not wanting the things to be changed gradually. In any case, any thoughts before we move on to the learning for this week about Liberia? The floor is open. All right, well, listen, if anybody does have a comment along the way, I really want to encourage you to feel free to shout it out. I won't see you raise your hand, so just squawk. If there's a point you want to make or a question you want to ask or a reflection that you want to offer. But today we're going to talk about, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Who's speaking?
Okay, so as we're wrestling with this, I fast forward ahead 100, 200 years, and what will the people at that time be saying about us? Right. That and I'm glad Gordon brought up, I could think of, it depends on fossil fuel. I've made the comment that I can see in future generations us being meat eaters, to probably a population that will probably be largely vegetarian. We being chastised for why would you do that? That's cruel. But Gordon brought up other good points, the economic disparity. I'm sorry, I know he had gun violence. What are the future 100 years from now, 200 years, what are people going to say about us? That we think we're trying to do our best, but they're going to be like, no, those people are idiots.
Yeah, I find it to be a fascinating thing because everything that we take things for granted. We don't really think about those issues, eating meat. I really enjoy that, but in future generations, will they think that, wow, what were they thinking? Yeah, good points. Thank you. Thanks, Don. Anybody else? Well, like I said, just shout it out if you have something you want to say in the midst of this. But we're going to learn about Liberia. What was going on there? As I mentioned before, we're learning about slavery, this big phenomenon in an inductive way through these two contexts, mainly Lawrenceville, New Jersey, and now Liberia. That was obviously the ACS's, the American Colonization Society's main effort to establish a country, a settlement in West Africa for freed slaves. So in the end, about 13,000 freed slaves were populated, colonized Liberia, maybe between 13,000 and 15,000. So how did it turn out? That's what we're going to talk about today. What happened in this afterlife of slavery? So before I get into that, I want to just a quick nod to one of the things that inspired all of this. I was invited in October to participate in an international conference in Monrovia that was co-sponsored by Princeton Theological Seminary, and I was invited to be on a pastor's panel and deliver a short paper because of our involvement with the ACS and Isaac Van Arsdale Brown and whatnot. The conference is called Afterlives of Slavery in the Transatlantic World. I never got to deliver that paper. It's a long story and for another time, but one of the participants, a professor from the University of Texas, fell and broke her hip. I ended up accompanying her on a medevac to Tenerife out of Monrovia, about halfway through. This is the professor, actually, Ginny. And there's Gordon, there's me. This is actually the mission, I'm trying to remember his title, but he was the mission coordinator for the PCUSA in West Africa. And he had a role in the conference too. These are some seminary students who are part of the delegation. So at some point, I may say more about that. A lot of academic papers about the afterlives of slavery, very, very interesting. All right, so a little context about Liberia today. Some key statistics that might enlighten you as to what that country's about. About 5.1 million people only live there. Capital city is Monrovia, named after President Monroe, who was president at the time of the founding of Liberia. Official language English. It's the Liberian dollar that people spend there, and the GDP is about $2.3 billion. And I don't know what our GDP is. Of course, we have a larger population, but it's many, many trillion by comparison. I highlighted these statistics just because I think they're so important to understanding the country. The poverty rate is 80% and unemployment rate 85%. These are 2021 statistics, but it's a very, very poor country. The gross national income per capita is $460. That's what, $1.50 or so per day, or less than $1.50 per person. So it's a very, very poor country. Rubber, it's worth mentioning, the Firestone Company has had a kind of checkered history, you might say, in Liberia. I think they would think that they made a positive contribution. A lot would say that they sort of took advantage of the people and the situation to get the natural resources that they needed for their corporate uses. There's a book called Empire of Rubber, which is definitely worth reading if you're interested in that particular history. So I want to say a little bit what was going on at the very beginning. So we had the ACS, founded in 1816, I believe is the date, and they raised a lot of money. Initially, they wanted to pattern what they were doing after what the British had done. The British had a kind of similar idea. They wanted to send free blacks back to Africa, and they created a settlement in Sierra Leone. And so Freetown is the capital of that country and the results of their efforts. But they had the same idea. We can't, those folks who are former slaves, they can't live in this place with us. We need to send them back to Africa. Not an easy thing. So just to give you some context as to how hard it was for these settlers to go there, in 1787, there were 400 settlers that the British sent to Sierra Leone by ship, and in that same year, there were only 64 left. So it's a pretty tough prospect. And it was the same for the early settlement of Liberia. So the first ship that the American colonization sent, some refer to as the Mayflower of Liberia, was called the Elizabeth. It set sail in 1820, and they thought, well, Sierra Leone, we'll just find another spot there to make our settlement. But it didn't go terribly well. A lot of people died of disease and not enough food. In general, in these early years, the settlement of Liberia was characterized by disease, lack of food, and sort of chaotic organization. So one statistic to give you a sense of that, of the around 4,600 immigrants who arrived in Liberia from the US from 1820 to 1842, only about 1,800 survived through 1843. That's a little more than a third. So I want to just drill down on this one really important historic moment in the founding of Liberia. It's called the Cape Mesurado Agreement in 1821. So in December 1821, the Alligator, a ship set sail captained by Robert Stockton, a famous military figure, admiral in the Navy, the guy who was for whom Stockton Street in Princeton is named. He was a Princetonian Presbyterian and a big supporter of the American Colonization Society, sort of like a real swashbuckling kind of guy. Pilots the ship, carrying also Eli Ayers, a major, the ACS agent. And their job was to secure land for this new settlement and to buy some land from the native people. So this is actually a picture of a tribesman for the, I think, Kron tribesman. And so this is what one of the kings might have looked like, kings in quotes, that they were trying to negotiate a land deal with. Didn't go too well. They spent 4 days on land to secure an agreement. There were 7 chiefs that were involved in this negotiation, and they delayed for several days. And you know, the famous thing about this is that Robert Stockton, you know, pointed a gun at King Peter's head and forced him to sell the land. It's not exactly how it went down. Their lives were being threatened. It was like a really fever-pitched moment in the negotiation. And for their own safety, he points a gun at one of the king's heads, and Robert Eyre shoots a gun in the air and so forth. But eventually they did make an agreement. But the key sticking point, let me just pause here. And I am asking for a certain answer. There's a certain kind of more right answer here. But if anybody wants to take a guess, I'd welcome anybody to take a stab at it. What do you think was a key sticking point? Anybody want to venture a guess? All right, going once, going twice. Catherine, do you want to make a guess?
Yeah, only because you talk about it a lot, but my guess is that the sticking point would be that the freed slaves, enslaved people coming from the United States would somehow have higher just power and status than the indigenous people in Liberia.
Yeah, that was definitely a factor. Yeah. However, in the negotiation, that's correct. But in the negotiation, it was maybe, you know, one of the points that was a sticking point, but the main sticking point was the fear that these folks are going to take away the slave trade, which was a lucrative thing. This was the pretty much the sole means of earning hard currency that the chiefs, that these people needed to buy things from Europeans like rum and guns. And the slave trade pre-existed European slave trading for many, many centuries. You know, Africans enslaved other Africans for many, many centuries. And they thought, oh, they're gonna take away our chief means of income, because by that time, in 1807, Britain had outlawed the slave trade. And interestingly, in 1808, the United States actually outlawed the slave trade too. And they were intercepting slave ships as illegal and involved in an illegal trade. So obviously lots of slaves already in America, but trading them had become illegal by that point. But in Africa still was happening for sure. And that was a big fear. So they finally get a deal, and this was the cost for buying this land. Now, it wasn't the whole country that we see as Liberia. It was a chunk of it where they did their initial colony and settlement. So bought for about $300 worth of goods. And, you know, these are some of the goods that they used to buy the land. Now there's controversy over this incident, you know, this moment, a key moment in the formation of the country of Liberia, as to whether, first of all, there really was an agreement, or if it was a myth and Europeans basically stole the land and created this myth that, you know, King Peter and these 7 kings, leaders of the local tribes, actually did sell it, and there was a real agreement. You know, and the idea that they bought the land for a pittance and tricked these local tribal leaders into selling them the land. So the original agreement has been recorded in a book. I don't know if Jackie, you've read it, but it's the ACS's History of the Colonization of West Africa. They have very detailed explanation of what happened, and they have actually a transcript of the agreement, but there was no original that had ever been found until 2022. And I don't know, Jackie, I'm sure you can appreciate this, that like, this is one of these big moments that a historian lives for. This guy, Patrick Burroughs, who's a retired professor at Penn State, was determined to find the original. And he was like looking for a needle in a haystack. He looked, and this during COVID, he was looking at all these digitized original source material among the papers of all the people, the big wheels, Francis Scott Key, all these people who were involved in the American Colonization Society. The last person that he checked with or checked into was Bushrod Washington, a former Supreme Court justice who was very supportive of the ACS. And he was sent a whole tranche of digitized original material. And lo and behold, it appeared before his screen, the original document, which is exactly the same as recorded in that book, The History of Colonization in West Africa. So, you know, it dispelled that there was this myth that there wasn't an agreement. There was, and it, you know, it was as cast in that book, and that the chiefs weren't very savvy negotiators. They'd been dealing with Europeans for centuries, and you know, a lot around, you know, trading goods and slaves and that sort of thing. And they actually sold the land for more than the price per acre in the US. So, you know, they were pretty smart negotiators. In any case, I thought that was an important moment to kind of zero in on, but the early history of Liberia, the first successful settlement happened in 1822 when the ACS sent really what, you know, took hold there on Providence Island, the first settlement. And so Liberia really traces its origins to this date in 1822. And so this theological conference was really in celebration of Liberia's bicentennial. So what happened after that? That's kind of some very broad brushstrokes summary of some of the early history of Liberia's formation. But what happened? You have all these freed slaves creating for themselves a nation, but you know, there were already people living there. So how did all that go down? Basically, the American Colonization Society ran the country and gradually handed over leadership to the colonists, the freed slaves who colonized the place, called the Americo-Liberians. 1839 was organized into the Commonwealth of Liberia, again, largely run still by the ACS, although the first non-white governor was put in place in 1841. Liberia declared independence in 1847. And interestingly, we didn't recognize it because of white Southern congressmen. You know, there's like, no, we're not gonna recognize Liberia. Interesting that, you know, here's probably an agent from the ACS. This is the original cabinet in 1847. So they're still watching over things, you know, but it's a gradual time when the reins were handed over to the colonists, not the indigenous folks, but the colonists. And in 1847, Liberia became Africa's first and oldest independent and democratic republic. So that's a great thing to be proud of, but there's a lot in this history that is not really, you know, inspiring of pride for sure, because the Americo-Liberians, the freed slaves who settled this part of the world, basically created the same society they came from, the same stratified plantation system from which they came. So you see here, like, you know, it's the same American flag that exists in America, fewer stripes and one star, but it's red, white, and blue. And they treated the natives as racially inferior to them. There's a lot of colorism going on in terms of light skin being preferred, and you know, the indigenous people again being inferior. And they essentially enslaved. I mean, that I don't think is too strong a word, the native population, which is a really interesting and ironic bit of history. Just a data point to prove that point, emphasize that. 1951 was the first election with universal suffrage. 45 is when there was partial suffrage, but the first where everybody in the country got to vote. Before that time, it was only, before 1945, only the descendants of Americo-Liberians had the privilege of voting. So again, this country was ruled by the descendants of freed slaves, the Americo-Liberians, until 1980. So this is the beginning of a very unfortunate period of time for the country of Liberia. So in 1980, a young military leader named Samuel K. Doe, who is the leader of a tribal faction, staged a coup. There was a lot of dissatisfaction, kind of going to the point that you made, Catherine, among the indigenous people. With that fear was realized because they completely lorded it over the indigenous population. until, the people organized militarily, and Samuel Doe took out, it ushered in a coup in 1980, and he immediately took President William Tolbert and his entire cabinet onto the streets of Monrovia, stripped them to their underwear, and in a very public spectacle, executed all of them. In public. So this period of time really, the Americo-Liberians developed some very strong social institutions, despite their elitism, or maybe because of their elitism. They built institutions in many ways that mirrored those in the United States, that were fairly strong and fairly well run. But this was a complete breakdown of those institutions because of Samuel Doe's administration's corruption and incompetence. It's a kind of the beginning of the breakdown of society. So 10 years later, Samuel Doe was executed on live television by Charles Taylor, another person who ushered in a coup. A long live television broadcast that showed the entire country he was hated, but it's a very shocking kind of bit of history that he was tortured and killed, again, on live TV. That led to the first Liberian Civil War. There were two. It's really one with just a pause from 1989 to 2003. And this image really kind of tells the tale of the complete breakdown of society and social norms, just kind of incredible, unprecedented violence and cruelty, including cannibalism in various forms, child soldiers. They were given drugs, and basically they were psychologically co-opted for the sake of the war. It was a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all in this period of time, especially toward the end of the Second Civil War. 250,000 people died, and about 1 million were displaced. So I want to end on a good note here. Peace did come in 2003, largely because of the women and the women's movement. One of the famous things about the women's movement was the sex strike. I don't know if you remember at that time, but and the main leadership for this movement came from the Lutheran Church, actually. The kind of one of the main leaders was employed by the Lutheran Church, and they all had their war council, so to speak, their cabinet to talk strategy. And one of the women said, "What if we refuse to have sex with men?" and got all the women of the country to do that. Oh, that's a great idea. And the tactic never actually worked there, but what it did was it drew international attention to the war in Liberia and created a lot of pressure to solve the problem. But they really were the impetus to get a peace deal in 2003. And interestingly, the first woman president was elected in Liberia in 2005, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was a relative success with some exceptions. She won the Nobel Peace Prize, and relatively good news for the country. A book I read in preparation for my trip to Liberia was this book by Layman Gabowi, who is the woman I spoke about a moment ago, employed by the Lutheran Church, who was the leader of this peace movement. Well worth reading, Mighty Be Our Powers. And there's an accompanying movie called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which kind of tells the same story. Definitely worth watching as well if you are interested and have the time. So I'm going to stop talking, and I am going to turn to my colleague Gordon McCoskey, and after that we're going to open it up just to discussion and any reflections that you might have about this history. But I asked Gordon some questions that were about, well, how do we make meaning of this part of the story, that the victims had become the victimizers in this story? Freed slaves who had suffered so much inflicted that same suffering on the people in the land where they were resettling. And so what do we make of that theologically, morally? So I want to end with his reflections on that. And as I said, then we'll have some discussion. I want to move on to Liberia and talk a little bit about how it turned out, and what unfolded when freed slaves and free Black people came to a context that was their ancestral home, but was completely foreign, and the culture that they created. Comment on how that unfolded, and any moral lessons for us in that history.
Well, it wasn't their ancestral home. Most of the people that the ACS sent to Africa were not from the Liberia area or from that part of Africa.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
one
Africa
thing.
in general, yeah.
Yeah. Second point is most of the freed slaves had never known anything except America. They're like, we don't know anything about Africa. We're Americans. Wow, I was born in South Carolina or Philadelphia. I don't know anything about that. And they said sometimes, kind of sarcastically, why don't you white people go back to Germany or England or whatever? You're from there. That's your ancestral homeland. And of course, white Americans would be like, no, that's not going to happen. We left there for good reasons and stuff. So there's that. Only a small minority of African Americans who were freed thought that going to Liberia was a good idea. Most of the Black community said, no way. It's racist and we don't want to get involved in that. We'd rather work for justice and equity here. A few Black people realized that America is a totally racist society and that was always going to be bad for Black people and people of color. So they're like, we think we'll try our hand at Africa. Ironically, the freed slaves who went to Liberia basically acted like white plantation owners. They disenfranchised the 17 indigenous groups of people, ethnic groups there. In fact, the people who were in Liberia already didn't get the vote until 1945. They couldn't even own property. So this very small group of elite Americo-Liberians, mainly concentrated in Monrovia, controlled all the wealth, had all the political power, and basically treated the people who were there as if they were slaves. So that's an irony. The kind of internalized white supremacy carried out by Black people, some of whom were mixed race, actually. The Americo-Liberians, some of them were shipped out of the United States because they had white plantation owner fathers and Black mothers who were slaves. So there's a colorism factor also. They were more light-skinned and therefore more civilized. And I mean, it's hard to wrap your mind around, at least for me, how the freed slaves who were shipped to Liberia became the new masters, and replicated what was done to them. The oppressed became the oppressors. In fact, it got so bad that there were 2 civil wars fought over this in the 1980s and 90s. And the ethnic groups that were there who were disenfranchised and disempowered basically said, we're not taking it anymore from this upper crust of descendants of people who had been shipped over from the United States. And so it was bloody, horrible civil wars, 2 of them. Actually, 1 civil war, I think, with 2 phases.
So do you think there are any theological implications? And I say that, Gordon, knowing that we have to be aware of the fact that we are people with a particular context of whiteness, and see the world through that lens. But as we might critique that, the way the history unfolded in Liberia, what theological implications might we make? Again, with that cautionary note in mind too.
Well, there's several ways you could go with that. I mean, at the most basic level, Calvinists and people in the Reformed tradition, of which Presbyterians are a part, emphasize the ongoing effect of sin, individually, but also collectively. So, nobody's innocent really in this matter. We all contribute to the problem in various ways. All the people who have power and money tend to have an outsized influence. It's also worth pointing out that slavery didn't begin with white Europeans or Americans going to West Africa. Slavery had been going on in Africa, Black people against Black people for centuries. So, there's culpability there as well. I mean, everywhere you look, there's culpability of one kind or another. It's kind of a mess.
Yeah. Well, isn't that kind of one of the tenets of Calvinism in a way?
Yes. No perfection. We're not Methodists like, Wesley thought we could, through prayer and good deeds and relying on God's grace to obtain perfection in this life, which means living a life of love. Calvinists, we don't really ever believe that. That's why we have to keep an eye on each other and hold each other accountable, because, we still have tendencies and desires which are bad for ourselves, bad for God, bad for each other.
Yeah.
And a lot of the racism that went on in the United States was conducted by and upheld by good church-going white people.
Yeah.
And likewise, the oppression in Liberia was conducted by people who were extremely churched. And the Americo-Liberians all went to church and were, Protestant to the core. So, yeah, it's complicated, but I think we can learn from that. Some of our best intentions may cover our own power and self-interested agendas and try to dress it up and make it look good.
So I'm going to stop there, and that's all the presenting I'm going to do. But I'd love for you to talk and ask, what's going on in your head as you have learned some of this, and there's just a very, very broad brushstrokes bit of history here, much more to be told. But how's it hitting you, or what reflections do you have, or what questions might you have?
Jeff, this is Polly. I wondered, were they set up when they went there? Did they come with capital? How did they accrue power when they arrived in Liberia?
I think it's a good and complicated question. And again, I didn't give my disclaimer at the beginning. I'm certainly not an expert on the history of Liberia or on the history of slavery, but from what I've read in the bit of reading, the whole operation was financed by a lot of people around here in the Princeton area through the American Colonization Society. And that's where the original financing came, and then natural resources eventually were exploited, as you saw there, in terms of the main sources of income for the country. Rubber was a big source of capital for the settlers. The indigenous folk didn't get much unless they were, they might have benefited through the jobs provided, but they were backbreaking jobs. But most of the capital flowed to the elites, the Americo-Liberians. And I suppose that insofar as all political power maybe ultimately derives from the point of a gun, well, those guns came from America.
Okay.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that if you have any knowledge about it? I don't claim in any way to be an expert on any of this stuff. Yeah, good question. I'm wondering, Jackie, if you had heard about that whole Cape Mesurado discovery, and whether that was something that, it may be a small thing in the world of historians, but I thought it was a fascinating story. Yeah.
I had not heard of it, but I'm not entirely surprised, because I think people don't realize that when archivists process collections, we're generally talking millions of sheets of paper, and we may not read every piece. Yeah. We'll group like things together and we'll describe what we know, but it's really up to researchers to go methodically, page by page, line by line, with documents and find those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I imagine you had a similar feeling when you discovered some surprising things about, Dr. Brown.
I was not expecting what I found, no, and thank goodness for the reason I even found the record I did connected to Dr. Brown was that someone had taken the time in the 1970s to go to Flemington, where the Hunterdon County record books were kept, the colonial slavery records, and transcribed them all and printed them in a little clearly typed book manuscript that has since been reproduced and reproduced and reproduced. But that information's been literally sitting there since that time period, since at least like the late 1970s, but never, as far as I know, noticed previously or attention paid to the meaning of that single record.
Well, it's fascinating. And I mean, I imagine you have to slog through many, many, many documents until, sort of, you get that one really interesting discovery.
Mhm.
Well, I'm going to toss a question. Anybody else toss a question out that, I think is a question that needs to be handled with care, but it has to do with, what do you make of this business wherein the victims became the victimizers? Some of us, and again, this is a sensitive topic too, in terms of Israel, people who are horribly oppressed and victimized, who some would claim have become victimizers in some form, as they occupied a new land. And what does that say about us as human beings? And again, I think I need to be careful as a white person, even asking that question, but it's one I think that is very important. How do we think about, we think about sin and its effects and so forth. But anyway, any thoughts about that? To me, that is a very troubling and interesting part of the story.
Well, the fact that it is so rooted in Christianity, the fact that they went there and the Liberians became kind of the most powerful people, and they were such God-fearing people and such faithful people, that troubles me a lot. That just the role that Christianity played in that perpetuation.
Yeah. But certainly didn't prevent them from seeing the moral problem of it. That's for sure. But one wonders if power had something to do with it too. Like you named that, I think, like when one has power and privilege, maybe it predisposes you to this, have this kind of moral blindness. I don't know, but we just seem to keep doing this. People of privilege oppressing others in order to preserve their privilege. Yeah.
Oh, it's certainly still happening today in Congress and the Senate. Few people have power and laying it on the rest of us.
Yes. Say more about that. Where are you going with that?
Oh, and Roe v. Wade being overturned, even though most people in America are like, no, we want some, maybe we don't personally want to have an abortion, but we want to still have the right for other women. And the people making the decision are saying it in Christianity. Of course, we don't want to hurt those innocent little babies.
Mm.
And I think of a friend who had an ectopic pregnancy, and she would have died had she had to have carried it to term. So why doesn't her right matter?
Mm.
But it's all in the name of Christianity. Even though Judaism, which is a strong, especially in this area, strong religion, they believe the right of the mother is more important than the right of the fetus or the baby being carried. If the mother's health is endangered, that's Judaism. Judaism believes in preserving the woman.
I mean, I think I hear you speak about that, and it reminds me about how, one of the one of the things that characterizes that debate is moral passion on both sides. And to me, this is really interesting because what's the opposite of moral passion, but kind of apathy? And I got to say, I have more respect for somebody like Isaac Van Arsdale Brown, who may have been wrong in his response to slavery and gradualist, and we can judge him for that. But he was passionate. I'm sure, Jackie, you can bear witness to that. And the people who are against abortion, but how do we have that same kind of passion for truth and for what's right, while also recognizing we may be wrong? You know, history may judge us to be wrong in the future. And I have not resolved that problem. You know, I sometimes think I don't have enough moral passion about the important issues that we need to feel passionate about and feel like, you know, this is wrong and I'm going to do everything I possibly can to make it right, like William Lloyd Garrison. But I may be wrong. You know, I may be Isaac Van Arsdale Brown and have the wrong solution. And so, you know, but to me, the worst thing is not to have moral passion, to just be going with the flow. You know, I've got my mortgage, I got my house, you know, I've got my comfortable life and whatever. Anyway, that's my little sermonette. I don't want it to necessarily be the last comment if somebody else wants to weigh in. Any final reflections before we depart here? Well, listen, y'all.
Actually, I have a thought.
Yeah.
So in some circles, they talk about colonization philosophy of the person in power coming in to the underclass with a solution. And what I'm hearing might be a better strategy is to seek ideas from the population itself in what's a good way forward, you know, rather than people of power coming into a community saying, we're going to build this school for you. We don't know if you really need a school or not, but we think this is the right thing to do. To get a consensus from the locals about what's the best way to help. And I wonder if maybe a better strategy for this slavery issue, and maybe even for current issues that we're dealing with, would be to go to the slaves and say, okay, if this situation were to happen, what do you think is a good way to, I mean, maybe the freed slaves might have said, you know what, give us a state out west of the Mississippi, give us ground, I don't know, right? I mean, but they might have said, keep us here, but we'll live separately.
Yeah.
That might have been their solution.
And that was William Lloyd Garrison's, you know, like, let's ask them what they need in order to secure their rights and dignity here. But, you know, I mean, that's a really good point. It's maybe makes me think about Pastor Luke, who's on the call here, and Ronid, and we can have that kind of colonizing attitude even in the mission work that we do, because I think that there might be times when, you know, Pastor Luke, folks from this country go to Haiti and think, well, here's how you should do it. You know, and maybe it means, oh, we think you need a well in your own village, whereas, you know, walking the few miles to the well is a way that community happens, and that would wreck it if our solution were adopted. I don't know if that rings true to you, Pastor Luke, or if you want to comment on that, but I know that's a story I hear at times about people wanting to do good stuff in mission, but then not realizing that they're sort of having that colonizing attitude even in that. Yeah, I don't know, Pastor Luke, if you want to say anything about that, but it'd be welcome.
Times, you know, even though we have the needs there for reservoir, for water, but usually when the people come, they always say, well, we thought, like you just said, we thought you need that, you know, but without asking, what would you like us to do for you? So yeah. I think, you know, many things happen like that, you know. But the main thing is always ask, what can we do? We see you have some needs, but what are the needs that would you like us, you know, to do for you? I think that will be the best way to do it.
Yeah, and one of the things I value so much about the Haiti ministry that is happening through you, Pastor Luke, is that you've enabled us as a church not to parachute into a situation and then leave it without knowing, without more learning of the context. You're our cultural guide there, and you're the person who's helped us to really understand what's appropriate for us as we apply our resources to help. And I think that's incredibly valuable. For those who might not know, and Jackie, Pastor Luke and Ronid are our mission affiliates in Haiti, and we've had this relationship for 25 years, or maybe many more than that. Pastor Luke is going to be speaking with us on Sunday to give us an update about what's going on in Haiti. So anyway, that's something to be celebrated. All right, final comments. I appreciate the discussion here at the end. Thanks for chiming in, folks. Final words. Yeah, go ahead, Jan.
Jeff, I'd just like to say thank you for doing this. I found it most interesting and really appreciate the work and the effort that you went into this. I knew a bit about it because I attended that one little group session, you know, that happened, I think, over at the seminary. And so I'm really glad I was interested to get more information. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, my pleasure. Thanks for tuning in and being part of it. It is a very fascinating bit of history, and I hope it was edifying for all of you. Yeah. All right, everybody, have a good night's rest, and we'll see you soon.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.